Hi, I'm AJ, and I'm the founder of the GBE Lab Series. Welcome to our conversation with co-authors Seth Levine and Elizabeth McBride. They will talk about their book, The New Builders, and why it's important to diverse entrepreneurs and founders, women, immigrants, people of color. So let's jump right in and welcome. How long did it take you to co-author the book? And tell us a little bit about the foreword and words by Tyra Banks.
To finish, like soup to nuts, it took us about 2 years to write the book, which is very fast for a book. And we did it that quickly, which was really hard because two things happened. One, we discovered that the story was more urgent than we realized when we started to do the research. And then the second thing that happened, of course, was the pandemic. And we thought that this was a moment in time when the world would be in enough flux and the crisis would be enough to refocus people's attention on some of the ideas in the book.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about the pandemic was, it created even more urgency. We initially set out to write what we thought was going to be kind of a lighthearted book. This was a couple of years ago when we first kind of talked about collaborating on a project like this. And we knew there were lots of interesting people starting businesses that weren't really being talked about in the mainstream business tech press. And we thought we'd write a book about them. We were going to call it Faces of Entrepreneurship and sort of tell some interesting stories of people outside of the mainstream eye. And then when we dug into it, we realized that entrepreneurship was really in trouble in the United States. And we weren't doing a good job of directing resources towards this sort of new majority, these people that are starting businesses that look a whole lot more like you. Pick up a book and they kind of skip the forward because they want to get right into the meat of it. And I think that would be a mistake here. And my favorite story about that forward is, mostly when someone writes a forward, they edit the forward that you sort of proposed to them, right? And so Elizabeth, in this case, wrote a really compelling forward for Tyra. I did some research, and it was great. And we sent it to Tyra, and she texted back and said, hey, awesome, but I gotta write this in my own words. It's got to be, for me. And then and we said, well, great, but we're kind of running out of time. And truly, both of us were on the East Coast at the time, and it must have been, I don't know, 4 or 5 in the morning East Coast time, this forward shows up, essentially what's in the book. We almost didn't edit it. She was willing to be that vulnerable and talk about her own struggles raising money. And it also, frankly, says a lot about our systems of finance. It's someone who is very well connected and well known and has all of these advantages, but is a Black woman, still isn't able to get, despite her advantages, still isn't able to get financing. And it really speaks to the challenge that we have ahead of ourselves to bridge this gap to new builder business.
Who are the new builders and why does it matter?
The new builders we came up with a name because we wanted to describe today's entrepreneurs, and they are mostly today's new entrepreneurs, mostly women, people of color, immigrants, which they've always been. And also older people that you wouldn't expect. One of the fastest growing groups of entrepreneurs are people over the age of 55. So those are the new builders. And the reason it's very urgent to understand who they are and what they're up to is that entrepreneurship in the United States is declining. Despite this recent, huge spout of headlines saying everyone's starting a business post-pandemic, the truth is it's a 40-year-long decline. It's going to be awfully hard to reverse that. And we need to reverse it along. I believe that so passionately, because I've seen so many amazing people of every color and sex and every position in life.
Any words for tech-enabled founders and those struggling to find a co-founder?
I think that there was a truism in the Valley that you needed to have a co-founder in order to build a successful business. And I don't know that I buy that anymore. I think that there are lots of ways to surround yourself with people who can help fill in gaps. And you don't sort of de facto need to have a co-founder. And in some respects, I've seen more businesses fail because of co-founder fallout than I care to count. Now, it's hard to sort of measure the inverse of that, which is how many businesses were successful because of this interplay between two different people who were co-founders. But I don't know that that's the critical thing. Like if you've got a good idea and you have the ability to express that to other people and either get raise financing, get customers, maybe people who might prepay for what you're building. I don't think you necessarily have to have a co-founder. If you're technical, you can start building yourself and sort of learn the business side, surround yourself with business mentors. If you're non-technical and you're on the business side, you obviously need to find someone who, or a group that can help you build. But these days, there are a lot of avenues for that. And there's plenty of codeless solutions as well that to get at least a prototype up and start marketing it and see if there's a, there's a market for your product. And so I think there are lots of ways for people to get started. And I don't know that I would recommend to someone that, they have an idea and, spin your wheels for 6 months trying to find a co-founder versus why don't you go start figuring out whether there's a real market for it and talking to customers. I think that's just more valuable time spent. And then, as the business grows, and it's actually quite common as the business grows that someone that you brought on early takes on a role that's more important. A co-founder is one of those funny things, like it's a title that can be bestowed by the founder. And so we've been in a number of businesses where the founder will say, hey, so-and-so is so important, I'd like to make him or her a co-founder. And my response to that is always, that's your call, right? As the founder, you get to decide, if you want to call someone a co-founder because they were that important, even if they weren't there on day one. And I think that's something people don't always kind of think about, right? I mean, sometimes many co-founders were not exactly founders of the business that they are co-founders of. They showed up a little bit later, but they were so instrumental that the founder said, hey, I want you to have this title. I want you to share in what is considered sort of the startup story of this business.
How can we increase value and address gaps for the new builders when many of the issues facing the new builders are systemic and complex issues?
In the book, we describe this changing landscape of entrepreneurs. And we call them new builders, but new builders, as Elizabeth described, are people of color, particularly women, particularly Black women. That's the fastest growing group of new entrepreneurs in the country, immigrants as well. And we describe this gap that exists between the people that are now starting businesses, these new builders, and the people that still control capital in our country, right, which tends to skew white and male. And you described it in your question as resources, and that's actually a really good way to say it, because resources encompass not just capital, although capital is incredibly important, but also the support networks that are required in many cases for people to launch successful businesses. One of the things that I think is important also to think about, and for the people that are watching this and listening to consider is another of the themes that we talk about in the book. We talk about starting businesses and we talk about new builders. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to sort of for the mind to stray towards what the business press tends to report on, which is technology entrepreneurship. But the vast majority of entrepreneurs and the vast majority of new builders aren't building tech businesses. Only about 1% of companies take money from venture capitalists. So one of the themes that we talk about in the book, which is a pernicious change in sort of the mindset in the United States, is this idea that entrepreneurship means tech entrepreneurship, right? Because it really doesn't. Like for hundreds of years, entrepreneur meant really anyone who was endeavoring to start a new business, whether that was a farrier or a blacksmith or a corner shop owner. And the truth is that most people starting businesses today are starting restaurants and health and beauty businesses and consulting shops and things like that. Only a very small percentage are starting businesses that are tech businesses. And so I think that's something that is important to kind of get on the table early, because we can get kind of lulled into this sort of trap, I think, that the United States has fallen into, certainly the business press has fallen into, with nomenclature. And we've really narrowed in a way that's dangerous our thinking about what does it mean to be an entrepreneur. And in large part, that's maybe the most important message we're trying to get across in the new builders is the value of these smaller businesses. We sort of use grassroots business, grassroots entrepreneur, new builder. These are all kind of interchangeable terms that we use in the book, but it's really important to recognize their power.
Describe the economic impact of small businesses and innovation by the new builders.
Small businesses employ almost half. It's just 49% of the U.S. workforce, and make up about 40% of the GDP. Now, a small business in the US is defined as anybody with under 500 employees. So that's a lot, that's a pretty wide swath of, but the vast majority of those businesses are actually single person shops. In other words, they're formal businesses. They owe taxes to the US government, but they only have one employee who's usually the owner or founder, the employee. But collectively, that group of businesses is just a huge, mighty weight in the United States economy. And the other thing that's really important, there's a number of things that are important that are economic, but not measured in numbers. And one of those is that from those businesses springs the dynamism of the US economy, because all of the change happens at the small end, right? Which is obvious when you start to think about it, but somehow we've lost sight of that fact that big businesses kind of exist to be disrupted by the smaller businesses growing up, right? In many different ways. It could be a whole bunch of small businesses disrupting one big one, a small business growing to be big. But in a lot of ways, small businesses create that energy, which is one of the things that's made the US economy so powerful for decades.
Well, one of the analogies that we sometimes use in describing sort of the overall economy is that of like a forest, right? And so, there needs to be a certain amount of sort of death, and, trees die and then they get broken down and become, fodder for the next generation of trees. And you kind of need this cycle, right? I mean, it needs to refresh itself. And our economy for hundreds of years has done a great job of refreshing itself. It's this dynamism that Elizabeth referred to. But our economy is becoming significantly less dynamic. The average age of a business is climbing rapidly because there are far fewer smaller businesses, newer businesses starting. And that's a real problem. And of course, just the overall number of new businesses starting is down significantly. And so, we're kind of missing that refreshment in the economy. And as Elizabeth described, most of the innovation in our economy comes from small businesses. Big businesses tend to innovate very incrementally, right? Because they've got their existing business. They don't want to be disruptors of themselves for a large part. And so it really is up to these smaller businesses to create that innovation and kind of nip at the heels, as we described it in the book, of these bigger businesses. And the fewer and fewer small businesses that we are funding and starting, the less chance we have of these sorts of innovations. And I think people think somehow that innovation economy is still alive and well, because if you read the business press, venture had a bumper year in 2018, 19, and 20, and even post-pandemic, right? It's pretty remarkable. And of course, venture drives some portion of the innovation economy, but I think it is a misunderstanding to believe that all innovation comes from venture-backed tech-style businesses. It's just simply not true. There's a lot of innovation that happens in all sorts of areas of our economy by small businesses of all different types. And by kind of choking off that innovation funnel, we're choking off the innovation economy in the United States.
How can the new builders remain optimistic about entrepreneurship in the US?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, we struggled with it so mightily during the writing of the book. Because Seth and I are both optimistic people, and we did not want to write a discouraging book. But the fact is that the research, in fact, it's like it paints a hard landscape for people who are starting businesses today, especially people who face systemic barriers. And we have a lot of examples in the book of people who did succeed, right? So that's one thing I would say is like keep your eyes on the people who have done it. And it is possible to do it. And I do think it becomes more possible every day as people become more aware. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, of course, that I mean, this is self-serving, but I actually mean it in a very earnest way, which is read The New Builders, right? I mean, we in part wrote it for new builders to get inspired, right? And I think one of the things that can be challenging as an entrepreneur is this feeling that you're kind of out on an island, you're by yourself. self. And I think that it's helpful to know that there are other people like you. And that's why one of the reasons why we told stories of new builders in such detail in the book is that we wanted other new builders to read it and say, hey, I recognize that.
Do you have any advice for Black female founders who are starting businesses at a faster rate than their counterparts? But when you look at revenue, they're bringing in less revenue than other demographics?
Raised by a black female founder, this is a tech business, in 2018, which is the year that we had data for when we were writing the book, was the median amount was zero. And they were only just a small handful that had raised $1 million or more. Now in the tech world, that's changing a little bit, which is good, really good. There's a lot of, particularly on the fund side, there are a lot of really interesting, diverse managers that are starting to garner more attention from the investor world, which is great. But in the broader economy, amongst more new builders, it's still hard to get a bank loan. It's still hard to find other forms of capital, and these networks can help with that. But really, I mean, as Elizabeth and I talk about in the book very, very clearly, in fact, we essentially end the book with this thought. We're calling on people that control capital to rethink how we distribute capital in the country. And we are actually, the two of us are actively working on trying to create new pathways for new builders to get funding, because it's just so critical for our economy and the health and future.
What conversations are investors having in relation to the new builders?
In the sense that, and it's finally sticking, right? I mean, I've been a venture capitalist for 20 years, so I've been through a few cycles of this. And looking back on my own behavior, just if I could be self-critical for a second, I mean, I actually thought I was doing something about it. If you'd asked me like 10 years ago, I would have said absolutely. And then I think if you look at my track record, it's absolutely not the case. And I think that a lot of people felt that way. And I think in the last, I shouldn't say a lot, a number of us thought we were trying to be part of a solution, and we really weren't being that. And but I think that in the last couple of years, that's changed significantly. And I mean, we've at Foundry, which is my venture firm, I mean, we've deployed tens of millions now of dollars against GPs and founders who are not white males. So women, people of color, Black men and women, et cetera. And so I think that conversation's finally starting to stick a little bit, because I think people like me who thought they were doing something finally realized that we weren't, and we're starting to sort of get over that. But again, I mean, that's a small slice of the economy. It's a really important slice because it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of companies. And so I think one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, Elizabeth and I have been thinking about a lot about, is sort of how do we broaden that access, right? How do we think about getting the corner store that's being started, more likely by a new builder, access to capital for inventory and for build out of their space and things like that. And
how can others connect with the new builders? And you could tell us more about that.
It's www.thenewbuilders.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. If you like the book and you are moved to, please leave a review on Amazon, because that does help.
yes,
sign up for the mailing list, and
we're Audible. The audio book just came out, and I think a lot of the early review. I mean, we had a bunch of reviews, but the early reviews were on Goodreads and Amazon, which are super helpful if people can do that. But we could use some. The book has a Twitter feed that's very active, and we have a Instagram account that's also quite active. So those are other ways to connect. And you can find links to both of those accounts.